Hello, Steve. Today is Friday, April the 4th. And while Rebecca Black may have taken most of the badass out of Fridays, we're putting it right back in. To continue the discussion we were having all week, we're going to talk a little bit about television. So I thought to myself, what's the most badass television show I can think of? You know, one of those shows worthy of a segment on Badass Mother Fridays. So today I'm going to declare that the TV show 24 is one of the most badass shows ever. For anybody out there who doesn't know, 24 follows counter-terrorist agent Jack Bauer, and it follows him throughout the duration of a 24-hour day, each episode being 1 hour of the day. I don't think they really need to say why Jack Bauer is a badass. For example, at one point in the show, Jack is interrogating somebody, and at one point he just pulls out a gun and shoots him, turns around to one of the other terrorists and goes, "I'm gonna need a hacksaw." The look on everybody's faces in the room is priceless. Totally badass. As a matter of fact, the majority of the characters in the show are badasses. And this is because the show followed what I call the badass principle. The characters in the show that followed rules and procedure are often viewed as the fan base's disliked. And the characters that the fan base just absolutely loved just reeked of badass. And essentially these characters break pretty much every rule just trying to get the job done. And we just loved every second of it, even though in real life we would completely be vilifying these people. And if there was a character in the show that was generally disliked, they had one way of gaining the trust of everybody who's watching. Do something totally badass, and all of a sudden, you're loved. One of my favorite and most badass characters in the show is none other than CTU agent Tony Almeida. And in one of the later seasons, we find out just how much of a badass he is. I'm not going to say which season it is so as not to ruin it for somebody who's never seen it before. So if you're somebody out there who watched the show, think about who your favorite character was and realize they were probably a badass. And anybody out there who hasn't watched the show, I highly encourage you to watch the first season. While some of the later seasons got a little bit ridiculous, the very first season was pretty much some of the most gripping television you can find. It really captured and portrayed the 24-hour narrative perfectly. Add in a bunch of twists that nobody saw coming, you have a great season of television. Which ended up being one of its downfalls as it went further on, because unfortunately they had to keep topping what they did last year. To the point where things got a little bit more ridiculous, and the 24-hour narrative wasn't quite as executed as nicely. But even with saying that, it was a great series from start to finish. So we've already identified that the characters in 24 were badass, but there's two other things that I considered badass. First off, the writers were totally badass. Overall, they were pretty much willing to go with any angle possible, and nothing was off limits. They threw in a ton of curveballs, which pretty much made every season interesting and unique. And while 24 was a show about a counter-terrorist unit, it was also a presidential drama. And one of the most badass things the show did is their presidential choices. In the very first season, they were chronicling a presidential candidate, David Palmer. And what made that story so unique was he was an African-American candidate, and at that time that had never happened in the presidency of the United States. Because, of course, at the time the show first aired, President Barack Obama had not even been to the picture yet. So the show was chronicling something that hadn't happened yet, but was pretty much going to happen at some point. And then towards some of the later seasons, there's another president involved. And the writers decided to cast a female president, President Allison Taylor. And that's pretty cool, so that's something that's certainly going to happen at some point. We don't know really when yet in real life, but it will eventually happen. So it was cool that they were able to tell that story on television first. And I can't think of another television series that ever has decided to go down that angle. And 24 ultimately decided to do the most badass thing with one of its presidents ever. And that's in one of its seasons actually decided to make their president the bad guy. Imagine the audacity to make the lead antagonist the President of the United States. Just the thought of that has endless possibilities. No, I'm not going to say which president ended up being the bad guy just for the sake of viewers who haven't seen the show yet. But trust me when I say it's pretty epic. The 8th season of 24 played out a while ago, and it was supposed to be the final season. But that wasn't meant to last forever, and in fact 24 is coming back this May. So with all the talk we've had about TV show finality this week, it's pretty interesting to talk about one that's actually coming back after finishing. Once again, another thing that doesn't happen very often. So overall, this Friday I'm labeling the show 24 as one of the most badass shows of our generation. It was one of the first lengthy serialized dramas I ever watched, and it sort of defined the way I watched television afterwards. Moving on to challenge progress, I ran another 2.5 miles on Thursday. This time a little bit slower, clocking in at 20 minutes and 8 seconds. I didn't run today, but that's only because I was taking today as a rest day. And that's because I'm running a 5-kilometer race tomorrow. It's part of a series of free races held by Mountain Equipment Co-op. In cooking news, I learned to cook one new dish, and that would be the creamy side dish of coleslaw. Pictures will be coming soon. So let's finish off with Battleship. Your shot, A7, was a miss. And my shot is G1. So Steve and everybody else out there watching, I hope you have a great weekend.